The letter arrived at the grand house on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, it had irrevocably shaken the foundations of their world. It was borne in on a silver tray, sealed with thick cream wax, and Lady Bramwell read it while standing by the breakfast-room window, the morning sun harsh upon her face. She read it twice. Then she sank into a chair, as if her legs had suddenly given way. Placing her hand flat on the table, she announced in a voice that had turned brittle that the Duke of Stormhaven was hosting a masquerade at Farfall, and the Bramwells were invited. A hush descended, the kind that precedes a storm, for the Duke of Stormhaven was not known for entertaining. Everyone knew this. He hadn't received guests in 6 years, not since his wife had passed, and the great house had fallen into shadow. A man who abstains from entertaining for 6 years, only to suddenly announce a masquerade, is a man who has been steered. His family, no doubt, had steered him. The letter conveyed this message as plainly as if it had been written in bold. The Duke was 46, a widower, the last of a distinguished lineage, save for a nephew he reportedly disdained, and his kin had decreed it was time to emerge from his seclusion, time to survey the season's eligible daughters behind their masks and select one, fulfilling his duty to his name. And into that room, unnoticed, carrying a can of hot water for a fire that refused to catch, entered a woman whom no one ever truly saw. Emelyn Kelmont was 43 years old, and she had been in service since she was 12. In 31 years, she had mastered the art of invisibility. She set the water down, knelt by the hearth, and coaxed the reluctant flames back to life, with the quiet persistence of someone who had coaxed many stubborn things into submission over the years. All the while, Lady Bramwell spoke above her head, as though Emelyn were merely a piece of furniture, which, to Lady Bramwell, she was. "The Duke of Stormhaven," Lady Bramwell declared, "and Sophie not yet spoken for. Do you grasp the significance? This is the hand of Providence. This is everything." She tapped the letter lightly against her palm. "Every mother in 3 counties will be preparing her daughter for that masquerade from this very morning. And my Sophie is worth 10 of them. She merely needs a chance to shine." Emelyn banked the coals, rose, collected her can, and departed. No one marked her leaving, for no one had marked her arrival. Her face was one that people's eyes simply slid past. She had cultivated this too. It was safer, in a grand household, to be a presence that eyes overlooked. She had so thoroughly transformed herself into such a being that she had almost forgotten there had once been a girl whom people looked at and smiled to see. That was a long, long time ago. She rarely thought of that girl. She ascended the back stairs to lay out Miss Sophie's morning attire, and found her charge perched on the floor by the window, knees drawn to her chest, her face ashen. Emelyn knew, before a word was spoken, that trouble brewed within the house, trouble entirely unrelated to any duke. Sophie Bramwell was 19, possessing a soft, nascent beauty typical of her age, and beneath that prettiness lay a stubbornness her mother had never bothered to acknowledge. She looked up at Emelyn, her chin set, her eyes brimming, and whispered that she would not do it. Whatever it was, she would not do it. She would die first. "You had best tell me," Emelyn said, "before your mother comes up. She will come. She holds a duke in her hand, and she'll want you dressed for him by noon." And so, Sophie told her. The words tumbled out in a rush, as they often do when long-suppressed feelings finally break free. There was a man. Of course, there was a man. At 19, there was almost always a man. This one was a curate, earning £40 a year, and holding a living he might attain in a decade, if he were lucky, patient, and someone died. His name was Mr. Adair. He was gentle, impoverished, and utterly unsuitable, and Sophie loved him with the entirety of her undivided 19-year-old heart. She had loved him since spring. She had told no one. And now her mother intended to parade her like a beacon before a duke, and she refused. She would not stand masked, to be appraised like a mare at a fair by a cold, elderly widower she had never met. Not when her heart was already pledged elsewhere. Not for anything on this earth. Emelyn sat on the low chair by the bed. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you certain," she asked, "of Mr. Adair, of your own mind?" Girls of 19 are certain of many things by Michaelmas that they've forgotten by Lady Day. I am certain, Sophie said. And there was something in the flat, direct way she spoke that made Emelyn believe her. She had heard a great deal of 19-year-old certainty in her time, and most of it carried an undertone that this lacked. This was quieter. This had made its decision. Then you are in grave difficulty, Emelyn said. For your mother has not the slightest intention of listening. She had the right. Lady Bramwell ascended within the hour, and a scene ensued, an ugly one. Emelyn stood against the wall, linen draped over her arm, a silent witness. Furniture, after all, can witness anything. Lady Bramwell did not shout. She was too astute for that. Instead, she spoke in that low, reasonable tone that is far worse than shouting. She laid out, one by one, the stark realities of their situation for her daughter, realities far less comfortable than the grandeur of the house suggested. For the Bramwells were not as affluent as they appeared. Sir Henry Bramwell had died, leaving his widow a fine house, a meager income, and a mountain of small debts she had spent 3 years concealing behind good linen and an excellent cook. The house was mortgaged. The carriage was rented by the season. And Sophie, pretty Sophie, was the family's sole asset, the last coin to be spent, and her mother was determined to spend her wisely, or go down trying with a duke. A duke had invited them to his home. Did Sophie comprehend what a duke represented? Did she understand that a curate with £40 a year could not possibly cover the interest on the house's debts, let alone support a wife? Did she grasp that rejecting a duke for a curate was not romance, but ruin? Ruin for herself, ruin for her mother, ruin for the very servants who would be cast adrift when the creditors arrived. You would have no roof over your head, Lady Bramwell declared. Nor would I, nor would anyone under this roof. Consider that, miss, before you speak to me again of your curate. She departed, leaving her daughter weeping on the floor. And she left Emelyn standing by the wall, linen over her arm, contemplating the road. And who was the first to tread it when a grand house crumbled? The servants went first. She knew she had witnessed it once before, in another house, long ago, when she was young. And she was no longer young. A woman of 43, dismissed without a character, did not easily find another position. She knew that too. She had known it for years. It was a knowledge like knowing the edge of a cliff beside which you've chosen to build your home. That precipice had been the ground she'd walked her entire life. That edge, and she had learned to navigate it without looking down. But now she looked down, because the masquerade was 3 weeks away, and Sophie refused to go. And if Sophie refused, the Duke would be offended. An offended Duke would talk. A family that offended a Duke would find every door in the county slammed shut against them. And then, the marriage that might have saved them all would never materialize. Not for Sophie, nor for anyone else. And then the creditors, and then the road. She saw the entire sequence laid out, link by link, from a girl's obstinate heart to an old woman in a ditch. And the old woman in the ditch, upon closer inspection, bore her own face. It was Lady Bramwell who conceived of the idea first, but it was Emelyn who made it feasible, and afterward, she could never definitively decide which of them should bear the greater burden of what ensued. Lady Bramwell conceived of it in the 2nd week, when Sophie remained unyielding, when the girl had moved from weeping to a silent, immobile stillness that unnerved even her mother. A masquerade, Lady Bramwell mused, half to herself, turning her rings. A masquerade is not like a ball. At a masquerade, the face is concealed, and a lady is merely a domino, a mask, a gown, and a posture, nothing more until midnight when the masks are removed. She observed her daughter's unyielding silence. Then, for the first time in years, she looked directly at Emelyn, who was mending a hem by the window. "Stand up," she commanded. Emelyn rose. Lady Bramwell circled her slowly, as one might appraise a horse. Emelyn was tall. That was the first observation. She had always been tall. Taller than Sophie, taller than her mistress, and she carried it with grace, without the stoop that servitude often imposes on tall women. She had a straight back, a steady gray eye, and a stillness that a foolish woman might mistake for meekness. A wiser one would recognize it as something entirely different. Her hair was dark, with streaks of gray at the temples, and her hands, when Lady Bramwell took one and examined it, were a servant's hands, roughened and capable. But gloves cover hands. You were raised in a gentleman's house, Lady Bramwell stated. It was not precisely a question. She knew the broad outlines of Emelyn's history, as mistresses know the essential details of their senior servants' pasts, without delving into the nuances. I was, Emelyn replied, raised alongside his daughter, educated with her, sat in the schoolroom with her, before you fell from grace. I was my lady. You can read, you can speak as they do. You have carried a lady's train, and stood in a lady's drawing room countless times, and know precisely how it is done. Lady Bramwell dropped Emelyn's hand. Her eyes had ignited with a sharp, hard glint, the spark of a nascent plan. You could stand in a mask for one evening and be mistaken for a lady. You could be taken for my daughter. Emelyn understood her immediately, and the comprehension coursed through her like icy water. No, she said, you have not heard me. I have understood everything, my lady, and it is madness to send a servant masked into a duke's house and present her as your daughter. If discovered, it is not a reprimand. It is the ruin you fear, amplified twofold. A fraud upon a peer is something for which they hang men or transport them, and I have no desire to see New South Wales. It would not be discovered, Lady Bramwell declared, the plan now fully formed. Emelyn could see it solidifying behind her eyes, brick by brick. You would go masked. You would be Miss Bramwell for 2 hours. You would be agreeable, dance a set, and speak with the Duke long enough to be seen doing so, ensuring the house is seen to have attended, that we are seen to have honored his invitation, that no slight is given, and no doors are closed, and you would depart before midnight, before the unmasking. He would feign a headache and leave, and Miss Bramwell would be indisposed the following morning, and there would be time to work on Sophie, time to win her over, time for the Duke's interest to be piqued by a masked lady he cannot find, so that when the real Sophie is finally presented, he is already 3/4 in love with the idea of her. She smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. You would buy us the one thing we lack, Kelmont. You would buy us time. And when the Duke wishes to call upon the lady he danced with, Emelyn countered, and finds a girl who is not she, when Miss Sophie cannot speak of the things the masked lady discussed, cannot account for an evening she never experienced, cannot be the woman he remembers, what then? Then that is next week's problem, and this is this week's. Do you have a better answer? Because I do not. I have a daughter who will not go, a duke who must not be slighted, and 3 weeks to reconcile the two. If you have a better answer, give it to me, and I will kiss your hand for it. If you do not, then hold your tongue and do as I bid you, for you are my servant, and I am telling you what I require. And there it was, the whole undeniable truth of it. You are my servant, and I am telling you what I require. Emelyn had heard those words, in one shape or another, her whole life, and they were the walls she lived inside. She could refuse and be turned off within the hour, without a character, and go into the road she had spent 30 years fearing. Or she could obey, put on a mask, and lie to a duke, and risk the road by a different door. There was no way out of the room that did not go through the road. There never was, for a servant. That was what it was to be a servant. You chose your risk. You never chose whether to risk. She thought of Sophie, white and silent on the floor, in love with her poor curate. She thought that she had once, herself, at 19, wanted something with her whole undivided heart, and had been told it was ruin, and had given it up, and had spent the 30 years since being furniture. And she found, standing in the window with the mending in her hands, that she could not, for her life, advise the girl to do the same. Let the child keep her curate a little longer. Let her keep her heart whole 1 more month. It was worth a mask. If I do this, said Emelyn slowly, you will not touch Miss Sophie's curate for the length of it. You will let the matter lie until after the masquerade. You will not force her while I am buying you your time. Lady Bramwell's eyes narrowed. She did not like to be bargained with by her own servant, but she wanted the thing, and Emelyn had seen that she wanted it, and a woman who wants a thing badly enough will pay for it, even to her furniture. Very well, she said. The matter shall lie until after. You have my word. Now we must see about a gown." And so it was that Emelyn Kelmont, 43, a lady's maid with a servant's roughened hands and a face that eyes slid off, was fitted in secret for a gown of silver-gray silk. It was finer than anything she had touched in 30 years. She was taught to answer to the name of Bramwell, and she was given a mask. The mask was the thing she remembered longest afterward. It was a domino of gray silk, cut close, worked at the edges with a fine thread of silver, and it covered her from brow to lip, and left only her mouth, her chin, and her steady gray eyes. She put it on before the glass, alone, the night before the masquerade, and she looked at the woman in the glass, and she did not know her. That was the whole trick of it. She saw the mask, did not hide her. It freed her. The woman in the glass was no one. She had no name that mattered, and no place that mattered, and no road waiting for her, because she did not exist. She was 2 hours of gray silk that would be folded away at midnight and never worn again. And a woman who does not exist can do anything. She can say anything. She has nothing to lose, because she has nothing. She is nothing. She is a mask, and behind the mask, for 2 hours, she can be a person. Emelyn looked at the masked woman in the glass for a long time. Then she took the mask off and folded it away, and went to bed, and did not sleep. Farfall on the night of the masquerade was a thing out of a dream. The Duke had done it properly, whatever he thought of it. The great house that had stood dark 6 years blazed now at every window. The drive was a river of carriages with their lamps swimming in the dark. And from within came music, and the great soft roar of a crowd at pleasure. Emelyn came up the steps on the arm of a hired footman, masked, gowned, gloved to the elbow, with her heart going so hard she thought the whole staring hall must hear it. But no one heard it, and no one looked. She was one gray domino among 100 dominoes, and the mask that hid her, and she passed into the Duke of Stormhaven's house, a nobody, exactly as she had passed everywhere her whole life. Only tonight, the nobody wore silver-gray silk. She had one task. "Be seen," Dancer said. "Speak to the Duke long enough to matter, and leave before midnight." She set herself to it, as she set herself to any task, steadily, without fuss. And the first part came easily, for a masked woman standing quietly by a pillar is a thing every ball has a dozen of. She watched the room. She had always been a great watcher. It was the servant's art to watch a room and see everything, and be seen by nothing, and she practiced it now, behind her mask, with a freedom she had never had. For tonight, she was not the servant clearing the room. She was a guest in it, and she could watch as a guest, and no one would send her for more candles. And so she was watching when the Duke of Stormhaven came in. She knew him at once, though she had never seen him, because the whole room knew him. The whole room bent toward him like grass in a wind, and the bending told her which he was. He was tall, dark, going a little gray where the candlelight caught him, and where it caught his eyes. They were a cold, clear slate blue. He wore his black mask and his plain dark clothes, with the air of a man attending his own execution with good manners. He did not want to be there. Emelyn saw it in an instant, in the set of his shoulders, in the exact and joyless courtesy with which he greeted the people who swam up to him. He was doing his duty. He was letting himself be shown the season's daughters, one masked girl after another, steered up to him by one determined mother after another, and he was bearing it, hating it, hiding the hating under a coldness so complete that the mothers took it for grace and were not warned. Emelyn watched him bear it for the better part of an hour, and something in her, some old, shut-away thing, unlatched a little, for she knew exactly what she was looking at. She was looking at a person being counted. She had spent her life being not counted, which is its own hard country. But she knew the neighboring country too, the country of the counted, of the person weighed and toted up and valued for the one thing they had that others wanted, and never once seen for the person carrying it. She had served a lady once, who had been counted so, married for her money, to a man who never learned the color of her eyes. She knew the look. The Duke of Stormhaven had it now, moving through his own blazing house like a prize being auctioned, and she found, to her surprise, that she was sorry for him. Then his slow, joyless progress round the room brought him, by no design of hers, to the quiet pillar where she stood, and stopped. He had come to the edge of the room, she understood later, for the same reason she had, because the middle of it was unbearable. Because at the edge, a man might stand a moment and not be swam at. He had not come to her. He had come to the pillar, and she happened to be at it, and he stood beside her, looking out at the dancers with his cold slate eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Two masked people at the edge of a room, full of people who wanted things from one of them, and nothing at all from the other. And Emelyn, who was no one, who was 2 hours of gray silk, who had nothing to lose because she did not exist, opened her mouth. She said the thing she would never in her life have said with her own face on. "You look," she said, "like a man being measured for a coat he does not want to buy." The Duke turned his head and looked at her. It was a long look and a startled one, and she felt it go over her masked face, her gray gown, her straight, tall stillness. She thought calmly, from very far off, that she had ruined everything, that no lady spoke so to a duke, that she had given herself away in a sentence. But she found she did not much care. She was no one. Let the no one be sent home. She was going home at midnight, in any case. "I look," said the Duke after a moment, "like a man being measured for a great many coats, none of which he wants to buy, by a great many tailors, who will not take no for an answer. You have the sense of it exactly." His voice was dry and cold, and under the cold, for the first time that evening, there was something alive. "You are the first person in this room to remark on it. Everyone else is pretending very hard that I am enjoying myself. You are not enjoying yourself in the least. I am not. Are you?" "No," said Emelyn honestly, though for different reasons. And something moved at the corner of the Duke's mouth under the black mask. It was not quite a smile. It stood on the near side of one. They talked for the better part of an hour. She could not afterward have said of what, though she remembered every word of it for the rest of her life. It had the quality certain talk has once or twice in a lifetime, a feeling less like two strangers meeting than like some conversation long ago begun, and long interrupted, taken up again in the middle. She was safe behind her mask, and being safe, she was free. And being free, she was for the first time in 30 years, entirely herself. The girl who had read in the schoolroom, the woman who had watched 1,000 rooms and understood them, the person under the furniture. She told him what she thought. She had never in her life told anyone in that house what she thought. And here she stood telling a duke because the Duke did not know she was furniture. The Duke thought she was a lady, and a lady may have thoughts. They disagreed about very nearly everything, and enjoyed it enormously. He thought the country dull, and she told him he had never once looked at it properly, that a man who found the country dull was a man who had brought his dullness with him. He thought books a poor substitute for living, and she told him that living was mostly waiting, in her experience, and that a person did well to have a book for the waiting. He asked her what she was reading, and she told him, and he raised a brow behind his mask and said it was grave stuff for a ball. She said that a ball was exactly the place one needed grave stuff to have something to hold to, and he was quiet a moment. Then he said that he had thought the very same thing standing in the door an hour ago, and had believed himself the only person in England to think it. "You are not the only person in England," said Emelyn, "to think anything. It is the great consolation of books that no thought you ever had is your own. Someone dead thought it first, and wrote it down, and it is a comfort on a bad night to be in such company." The Duke looked at her. "Who are you?" he said, and Emelyn's heart, which had been going quiet and glad, went cold. That was the question the whole evening turned on, the question she must not answer, and she felt the mask on her face all at once as a lie, and not a freedom. "I am a woman at a masquerade," she said. "Which is to say, tonight, no one. That is rather the point of a masquerade, your grace. For one night, no one is anyone. You are not a duke. I am not. Whatever I am, we are two masks that fell to talking by a pillar. Tomorrow the masks go back in their boxes, and we are our dull selves again. And this did not happen." She meant it lightly, but it came out with more under it than she intended. and she saw him hear the under part, the way he seemed to hear everything. "And if a man wished it to have happened," said the Duke, "if a man tomorrow wished to find the woman who told him he looked like a coat he did not want, where would he look?" "He would not look," said Emelyn. "That is the kindest thing I can tell you. He would not look because there is nothing to find, because the woman he liked was the mask and not the face, and the face would only disappoint him. Let her be the mask. Let this be the one clean thing. Do not spoil it by looking." Then the great clock began to tell the 3/4 before midnight, and Emelyn came back to herself with a lurch, for at midnight the masks came off, and at midnight she would be a servant in silver silk before the whole of the Duke's house. She rose from the little gilt chair where they had come to sit, and said that she must go. "Dance with me first," said the Duke. "One set. It is the one thing my rank is good for, that no one dares stare at what I have chosen to stand beside. Dance with me, and I will stand between you and the whole room. Then you may go and be your dull self, and I will be mine, and we will neither of us spoil it." One said, "I am asking you. I do not, as a rule, ask." And she should have said no. She knew she should have said no. There was no time. Midnight was coming, and the whole plan was to be gone before this. Gone clean, leaving nothing behind but a pleasant memory of a masked Miss Bramwell. But she had wanted just once, just for an hour, to be a woman in a ballroom, and not a secret in a gray gown. The wanting had got into her. She gave him her hand. He danced well, and he did what he had said. He stood between her and the looking by the plain fact of who he was. For the length of one set, Emelyn Kelmont was absurdly, impossibly at ease in a Duke's arms, in a Duke's blazing house, and happy with a happiness so unfamiliar, it frightened her more than fear would have. When it ended, he did not release her at once. He held her hand a moment longer than the dance required, and he looked down at her masked face with his cold eyes gone, not cold at all. And Emelyn heard the clock, and knew midnight was on her, and did the only thing left to do. She took her hand back. She said low that she was sorry, that she had told him true, that there was nothing to find, and he must not look. And she turned and went quickly now through the press of the room toward the door, not running, because running is how you are caught, but going behind her. She felt his eyes on her the whole length of the room, and she did not look back. She went out through the great blazing hall into the cold dark, and the night swallowed her, and it was over. It was not over. She knew it was not over before she was halfway home in the hired carriage, sitting in the dark with the mask crushed in her 2 hands. She had done the very thing she was sent not to do. She had been sent to be forgettable, and she had made herself to the one man in England it mattered to, unforgettable. She had meant to buy time with an evening no one would remember, and instead, she had given the Duke of Stormhaven the one evening in 6 years he would not be able to forget. She had felt it in the way he held her hand, and she had done worse than ruin the plan. She sat in the dark carriage and made herself look at the worst thing she had let herself want. 30 years she had spent not wanting, folding the wants away small as they came, keeping the drawer of them shut, and 1 hour behind a mask had sprung the drawer. Now she wanted, God help her, at 43, like a green girl, and the thing she wanted was a duke, which was the oldest and most foolish wanting a woman in service could fall into. She knew it, and it made not the smallest difference. The heart does not take instruction. She had learned that once before, long ago, and given up what she wanted, and been furniture ever since, and she had thought the lesson had taken. It had not taken. It had only waited. She let herself into the great house by the servant's door, and went up the back stairs in the dark. She folded the gray mask away in its box and lay down in her narrow bed, in her narrow room under the eaves, and did not sleep. She told herself over and over that in the morning she would be Kelmont again, that the evening would close over like water, and that no harm would come of it. But she had not reckoned on the Duke of Stormhaven. He had watched her go the length of the room, and he had let her go because she had asked him to, and because a man does not chase a woman across his own ballroom before 300 guests. But he had stood where she left him, with the strangest sensation he had known in 6 years, the sensation of a door standing open, in a house he had believed shut up for good. He was 46. He had been hunted for his title since he was a young man. He had buried a wife he had been fond of, without ever quite loving, and had gone into the dark after her, more from a great weariness than from grief. He had lived there so long, he had forgotten there was anywhere else to live. He did not chase women. He was chased. That was the settled shape of his life. The hunter and the hunted, and he the hunted. He had grown a shell against the hunting, so thick that no woman in 6 years had so much as knocked on it. And a masked stranger had stood by a pillar and told him he looked like a coat he did not want to buy, and had wanted nothing from him, nothing at all. Had told him plainly not to look for her, and had walked out into the dark asking him for nothing but to be let go. In 24 years of being wanted for the wrong thing, it was the first time he could remember being wanted, if he had been wanted at all, for the right one, or not wanted. That was the marvel of it. Not wanted. Seen and talked to like a man and then let go. He did not have the word for what it was. He only knew that the door had opened, and that he could not for his life make himself shut it again. He looked for her, of course. He had said he would not, and she had asked him not to, and he did it anyway. In the quiet, stubborn way he did everything, telling himself sensible reasons the while. He was curious. A man liked to puzzle. He had every right to know who had been a guest in his own house. He asked his aunt, who had stood at his elbow half the evening, marking the field for him, whether she had seen the tall lady in gray by the west pillar, the one he had danced with. And his aunt, who missed nothing, said that the tall lady in gray had come with the Bramwells, that she had left before the unmasking, pleading a headache, and that she was, she believed, the Bramwell daughter, Miss Sophie Bramwell, of whom she had heard the mother speak. Bramwell, said the Duke. Bramwell, said his aunt. She was watching him with a sharp, bright, interested eye. For Lady Eleonora was 81 years old, and had been trying to rouse her nephew out of his dark for 6 years, and she had seen him dance twice with a woman in gray, and hold her hand at the end a beat too long. She meant to know why. A widow's daughter, small fortune they say, and worse debts, and the mother a pusher, but the girl herself I know nothing of. You seem to find her worth knowing.
I found her, said the Duke slowly. The first person in that room who was real.
I should like to know her better. And Lady Eleonora, who loved her nephew and wished him living again more than she wished anything on earth, said that nothing was easier. He had only to call or to ask the Bramwells to Farfall. A duke who wished to further an acquaintance had merely to lift a finger, and the whole world came running, which was true, and was exactly the trouble, though none of them knew it yet, for the finger was lifted. Within the week, a letter went from Farfall to the Bramwell house. An invitation, warm as the season's first had been formal, asking Lady Bramwell and her daughter to Farfall for a fortnight's stay, a small party, the near neighbors, some music, some walking. The Duke would be so glad, and Lady Bramwell read it, standing at the same window, and this time her knees did not give out. This time she gave a small, hard sound of triumph, for the plan had worked, and worked past her wildest hoping. The Duke was caught. The Duke wished to further the acquaintance. The Duke was 3 parts in love with a masked lady he could not forget. The only difficulty was that the masked lady was her lady's maid, and it was her daughter he had asked to Farfall. There was a scene about that too, and Emelyn stood against the wall through the whole of it being furniture, hearing herself discussed, as furniture is discussed. A thing to be moved here or there, as the plan required. Lady Bramwell's plan was simple, and to Lady Bramwell elegant. Sophie would go to Farfall as Miss Bramwell, which she was, and Sophie would be the lady the Duke had danced with, which she was not. The difference between the two would be papered over by keeping Sophie quiet and modest, and a little unwell, a girl who did not say much, whose masquerade brilliance had been the brilliance of the masquerade itself, of candlelight and mystery, now decently faded into a shy country modesty. Men, said Lady Bramwell, expected girls to be duller in daylight than in a ballroom. It was the way of the world. The Duke would find his masked lady a little quieter than he remembered, and set it down to maiden shyness, and caught her anyway, for he was caught, and a caught fish does not examine the hook. And Kelmont comes too, said Lady Bramwell, as your maid, which she is, and keeps out of the way, which she knows how to do better than any woman living. And if ever the Duke wants a word too clever for you to answer, Sophie, you will plead your head or your shyness, and you will come away and find Kelmont. Kelmont will tell you what to say, and you will go back and say it. Between the two of you, you will be one whole woman the Duke can love, and once he has offered, there will be time enough to be only yourself. She smiled her hard smile. It has been done before. It will be done again. It is only a fortnight. Anyone can be anything for a fortnight. Emelyn said nothing. There was nothing to say. She was furniture, and furniture goes where it is carried, and she was carried to Farfall. She should never have gone. She knew it even as the carriage turned in at the great gates. Up the long drive she had come up masked 3 weeks before, toward the great house she had left in the dark. She should have refused, should have taken the road rather than this, for this was madness twice over, to walk back into the Duke's own house as a servant, and to be under his roof for a fortnight, while another woman was courted in her name. But there was Sophie, pale and miserable beside her in the carriage, sold to a scheme she loathed to save a family she could not save alone. And there was the plain fact that a servant who refused was a servant in the road. And there was under both of those a third thing that Emelyn did not look at directly. A small, treacherous gladness at the bottom of all her fear, that she would be under his roof, that she would breathe the same air, that she would see him again even from behind the furniture. She despised herself for it. It changed nothing. Farfall, by daylight out of its masquerade blaze, was a graver and a sadder place than she had known. It was beautiful, with the beauty of great old houses that have grown out of their land, as though the hills had decided to make themselves a shape in stone. But it was a house in mourning. She saw it at once with the servant's eye that reads a house the way a shepherd reads a weather. There were rooms shut up. There was a wing no one went into. There was a hush over the whole of it, a held breath 6 years old, the hush of a house whose mistress had died, and whose master had never let it wake. And into this grave, hushed, beautiful place came the Bramwells with their scheme, and their maid, with her mask folded in the bottom of her box, and the trouble that had begun at a pillar wound itself a turn tighter. The Duke came out to greet them on the steps, and Emelyn, getting down last and unregarded, saw the exact moment his cold face changed, and then changed back. He had come out to meet the woman from the pillar. She saw him look for her, saw the quick, involuntary search of the two Bramwell ladies getting down, the mother and the pale daughter, saw the search find no one it knew, and the cold shell come down over the puzzlement, like water over a stone. He bowed. He said the right things. He gave his arm to Lady Bramwell and led the party in, and Emelyn, 3 feet away, unregarded, gathering the shawls and the small cases, watched the man she had talked to for an hour look at the girl he believed she was. He couldn't find her, and he couldn't fathom why. And she, with a grief that startled her by its intensity, believed she was the cause. A promise made in disguise. A promise a pale, silent stranger could never keep. Now he would spend 2 weeks wooing the phantom, and in the darkness, he would wonder where the real woman had vanished. Those 2 weeks were the strangest, the most wretched of Emelyn's life. And though she'd never admit it, not even under duress, in its own bruised way, they were also the sweetest. It began, as Lady Bramwell had orchestrated, badly, but not catastrophically. Sophie was introduced as the masked lady, now grown shy, and the Duke received her with a courtesy that Emelyn, ever watchful, interpreted as barely contained bewilderment. He tried. Emelyn granted him that, observing from the periphery. He was a man of his word, having invited these people to his home, based on an hour spent by a pillar. He genuinely attempted to find in the quiet, pale Sophie the woman he remembered. He walked with her. He sat beside her at dinner. He once asked her what she was reading. Sophie, having been thoroughly briefed, named the serious book Emelyn had mentioned at the ball. And Emelyn, standing behind her mistress's chair, saw a flicker of hope ignite in the Duke's eyes. Then she watched him pose a follow-up question about the book, a genuine inquiry, a desire to recapture that conversation, and she saw poor Sophie, who had never even opened the book, flush scarlet and fall silent. The light extinguished from the Duke's face, and Emelyn had to look away, at the wall. It was cruel. In her planning, she hadn't grasped the depth of its cruelty. It was cruel to the Duke, offered a shell and told it was the precious pearl he remembered. It was cruel to Sophie, forced to impersonate a woman she wasn't, in service of a marriage she dreaded, all while her heart yearned for the poor curate she loved. And in a way Emelyn hadn't anticipated, it was cruel to Emelyn herself, condemned to stand sentinel behind the chair, watching the man she had dared to desire turn away, always in the wrong direction, reaching for her, through a substitute incapable of holding what he sought. And then, something happened that no one had planned. Something that altered the entire trajectory of events. It happened because a duke's estate is vast, and a fortnight is a lengthy span. And a man reaching in the dark for the woman he has lost will, in the end, grasp at any light. He began to speak to the maid. It started by chance in the library on the 4th day. Emelyn had entered early, before the household stirred, because the library at Farfall was a marvel, a grand, high-ceilinged room brimming with books, unlike anything she had seen since her girlhood schoolroom. She couldn't stay away. She'd told herself she was merely there to dust, using a cloth as a pretense. But a book lay open on the sill, and the cloth dangled forgotten in her hand. When the door opened and the Duke entered, there was no time to become mere furniture, no time to shrink herself away. He found her there, a servant with his book in her hands, the dawn painting her face. He stopped. He looked at her. He had descended early, unable to sleep, expecting the room to be empty, only to discover a tall, gray-templed maidservant standing in his library, holding one of his books, clearly engrossed in reading it, caught in an act that servants simply did not perform. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Emelyn stammered, closing the book, instantly reverting to her role as unseen furniture. Eyes down, still apologetic, invisible. "I was dusting. I shouldn't have opened it. It won't happen again." "What were you reading?" the Duke asked. She felt she had no choice but to answer. He crossed the room and retrieved the book from the sill. He looked at it, then at her. For the first time, a faint stirring, something entirely unrelated to her, appeared on his usually impassive face. A curiosity about a maid reading serious philosophy in his library at dawn. A small, intriguing puzzle. And the Duke of Stormhaven, once he grasped a thread, would pursue it relentlessly. "You read this," he said, clearing his throat, "for pleasure, at dawn, in another man's library. I read whatever I can reach, Your Grace, when I have the opportunity. Such chances are uncommon in my station. I beg your pardon for the liberty." "Do not," the Duke said, "ask my pardon for reading. It is the one liberty in this house I wish every soul under it would take, and yet none of them do." He placed the book back on the sill, open where she had left it, and studied her for another moment with his slate-blue eyes. Then he departed, leaving her there, and the book open. Emelyn stood in the nascent light, her heart pounding, realizing she was in profound danger, a danger entirely unconnected to New South Wales, for he returned. That was the unforeseen element, the one she could no longer prevent. He reappeared in the library the following dawn, and the maid was there. They spoke of nothing but the book, and then the dawn after that. Gradually, over those still, gray early hours of that peculiar fortnight, the Duke of Stormhaven and his guest's lady's maid fell into the habit of conversing, not as duke and servant. That was the marvel and the terror of it. He seemed to forget, or set aside, or perhaps never truly registered, that she was a servant, because she spoke to him in a manner neither a servant nor a lady would. It was the way the masked woman by the pillar had spoken, plainly, truthfully, as one mind to another, holding nothing back. Because a servant caught reading has already lost everything a servant can lose and might as well be honest. She had nothing to protect. She was furniture, and furniture, it turned out, could say anything. She never told him she was the masked woman. She wasn't that foolish. She kept the two identities separate in her mind, with a discipline that cost her more than he would ever know. The masked Miss Bramwell of the ballroom, and the maid Kelmont of the library. Two women, two masks. She never allowed one to bleed into the other, never alluded to the pillar, never let slip a word that might make him turn his head and see. But she couldn't halt the inevitable. She couldn't stop him from coming to the library. She couldn't prevent him, over those dawns, from doing precisely what he had done at the pillar, reaching past the carefully constructed edifice of his life, towards the only voice in the house that spoke to him with truth, and discovering, without the slightest comprehension, that the voice belonged to a servant. And she couldn't stop herself. That was the bitterest part. She had inadvertently unleashed her own hidden desires at the masquerade, and they refused to be contained, and each dawn in the library only fueled them further. She came to know him in those twilight hours, in a way she had never thought to know any man. She learned that his coldness was a facade, not an intrinsic part of him. Beneath it lay a man who was patient, precise, and far kinder than he allowed the world to see. A man who had been valued his entire life for a mere accident of birth. A man so weary of it that he had retreated into obscurity rather than endure such appraisal again. She learned he had not loved his wife, and grieved that he hadn't, carrying that unexpressed love like a heavy stone. She learned he was lonely, a loneliness as vast as his grand house. Everyone in his life performed for him, bowed to him, sought something from him, and for 6 years, longer than 6 years, no one had simply talked to him, until a masked stranger, and then a maid. "You are the only person in this house," he said to her once in the gray dawn, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the cool expanse of the library. "Who doesn't want something from me? Do you know how strange that is? Everyone wants something. My guests want my attention. Their mothers want my name. My own people want my happiness, which is merely another thing to want, and heavier than the rest. For I cannot give it to them. And you want nothing. You stand there, wanting nothing. And it is the most restful thing I have known in 6 years." He then turned his head and looked at her, and his slate eyes were no longer cold. "Why do you want nothing?" And Emelyn, who yearned for him with her entire exposed and aching heart, who desired him so fiercely that the wanting was a physical pain beneath her plain gray gown, looked back at the man, and lied with a steadiness she was proud of. "Because I learned not to, Your Grace," she said. "It is the first lesson my place teaches. A servant who wants is a servant who suffers. So, we learn not to want, and it is a difficult and lonely lesson. But it is effective. You should try it. It would rest you better than I do." "I do not think," the Duke said slowly, his gaze on her, "that you have learned it half so well as you pretend." Emelyn quickly changed the subject, her hands beginning to tremble. She excused herself from the library and stood in the cold corridor, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes shut, realizing that the situation was beyond repair. She was in love with the Duke of Stormhaven. A maid of 43 in love with the Duke, a notion bordering on foolishness, a kind of madness. The only course of action left was to endure the fortnight without being discovered, then return home, lock away that drawer of desires, and remain furniture until her dying day. She hadn't anticipated how a house observes, for a house is more than its master and mistress alone. A house is all its people, high and low, and the low observe more than the high ever dream, and the low of Farfall had begun to whisper. The dovecote gave her away first, a detail she would later find amusing, when amusement was possible. There was an old dovecote in the Farfall Gardens, and its doves were half wild. They would alight for no one. They would scatter in a white flurry from any hand that approached. Emelyn, walking in the early garden during her one allotted half-hour of freedom from her pretense, had fallen into the habit of feeding them with crusts she saved, and the doves, who scattered from the gardeners, the grooms, and even the Duke himself, had come to know her over the days. They would settle on her shoulders, her arms, her open hands. A gentle, soft gray weight, as docile as could be. It was the sole sweetness of that bitter fortnight, the doves that trusted no one, trusting her. The Duke noticed. He emerged one dawn, couldn't find her in the library, and wandered into the garden. And there, across the wet gray lawn, he saw his guest's lady's maid, standing by the old dovecote. The half-wild doves he had never once been able to approach were settled all over her, on her shoulders, along her arms, in her cupped hands, and her gray-templed head was bowed towards them. There was something in her entire tall, still figure that arrested him where he stood. He didn't approach her. He watched, and Lady Eleonora, emerging with her stick for a breath of air, found her nephew standing on the wet lawn, staring across it at a maidservant covered in doves. A look on his usually cold face that she hadn't seen in 6 years and had thought never to see again. The old woman glanced from the man to the maid and back, silent, understanding far more than either of them before they did. For Lady Eleonora had been at the masquerade, and Lady Eleonora, unlike her nephew, possessed a long memory for a posture. 3 weeks prior, she had noted a tall lady in gray by the west pillar, observed the straight back, the steady stillness, the tall head, and had deemed her a fine specimen of a woman, wondering a little why Miss Sophie Bramwell, who was small, soft, and delicate, should be referred to afterward as that gray pillar lady. And now here stood a tall, gray-templed maidservant with the exact same straight back, steady stillness, and tall head, covered in doves that would go to no one, and her nephew was staring at her as if she were water in a desert. Lady Eleonora, at 81, had lived a full life not by being slow, but by being keenly observant. From that morning onward, she watched with the full force of her sharp, aged attention, missing nothing, and biding her time. The unraveling began in the 2nd week, and like many such things, it happened all at once, from 3 distinct fronts. The first was the Duke himself. Over the preceding fortnight, he had found himself in a place he didn't understand and couldn't remain in. He had come to Farfall's season of courtship with the intention of wooing Miss Sophie Bramwell, the masked lady of the pillar. Instead, he'd discovered Miss Sophie Bramwell to be a pale, silent stranger, clearly not the woman he remembered. To his astonishment, in his own library at dawn, he'd found the woman he did remember, clad in a maid's simple gray gown. This clash of realities began to tear at him, for he was an honorable man. He had invited these people to his home under the pretense of an offer, and honor bound him to the pale girl. Yet, his entire starved heart yearned for the maid. He was unaware she was the masked woman. All he knew was that at 46, he was falling, shedding all his defenses and reason, in love with a servant. And a duke, he knew, does not marry a servant. He cannot. He considered himself a fool and a scoundrel, in love where he had no right, and courting where his heart held no interest. This charade, he realized, could not continue. He was certain of it. One gray dawn, he resolved to speak plainly to the maid, to discover if this infatuation was solely his own. Whatever her answer, he would send the Bramwells home and be done with it, for he could no longer offer a hollow courtship to the daughter, while his heart broke for the servant in the corridor. The second front was Lady Bramwell. She, too, had sensed the shifting winds, and was deeply displeased with their direction. Her scheme had initially thrived, only to curdle. She had brought her daughter to be courted, but the Duke was not courting Sophie. He was cold to her, colder by the day. Lady Bramwell, who overlooked much about people's hearts but little about her own advantage, began to track where the Duke's averted gaze fell when he believed himself unobserved. His eyes drifted, impossibly, towards Kelmont, towards the maid, towards her own lady's maid, whom she had brought to feed Sophie her lines. This sly, deep creature had somehow captured the Duke's attention herself, and was now ruining everything. Everything. The entire scheme, the family's sole hope. Fueled by what could only be the vanity and ambition of a servant who had forgotten her station, Lady Bramwell's fear transmuted, as it does in small, cruel hearts, into rage. This rage found its target, and its target was Emelyn. The third front was Sophie. She had reached the absolute limit of her endurance, and, on the very morning everything imploded, she did the one brave, true thing that would save them all, though at the time, it seemed like the ruin of everyone. It happened in the long gallery, after breakfast, and in front of witnesses, which was the most devastating part, and, as fate would have it, the most fortunate. The house party was assembled, the nearby neighbors, Lady Eleonora, a dozen others, and the Duke among them, his demeanor cold and resolute, having made his dawn decision and merely awaiting the opportune moment to act. Lady Bramwell, who had lain awake seething with rage, chose this gathering to strike at Emily. She intended to have her dismissed on the spot, sent packing before she could inflict further damage. Removed from the house and from the Duke's sight, back to the anonymity of the servants' quarters where she belonged. She delivered her accusation in a low, reasonable tone, more chilling than any shout, turning to face Emelyn, who stood by the wall behind Sophie's chair, an unobtrusive piece of furniture. Lady Bramwell said pleasantly, and terribly, that she must beg the Duke's and the company's pardon for a small domestic matter. Her maid, she lamented, had sadly been forgetting herself. The woman, she claimed, had been found reading in his library, a place she had no business in. She had been seen wandering the gardens at all hours. In short, she had presumed upon the freedoms of a grand house in a manner utterly unbecoming, and Lady Bramwell would be sending the woman away that very day, without the character reference such a woman deserved. She hoped the Duke would forgive that his hospitality had been so abused by a servant who had grown above herself. A silence descended upon the gallery, the kind that precedes a storm. Emelyn remained perfectly still against the wall. She had known this day, or something like it, would come from the very first. She had known it, and she had come anyway. And now, the bill was presented. The full bill. The road, ruin, no character. 34. Dismissed in disgrace. The precipice she had skirted her entire life was finally opening beneath her feet. She did not weep. She had shed her tears long ago over other losses, and had none left to spare for an audience that would only relish them. She lifted her head, her gaze not on Lady Bramwell, but across the gallery, toward the Duke, one long, final look at the man she had allowed herself to love, and she prepared to depart, unburdened by words, with the only thing she had left, the dignity of her departure. And Sophie stood up. Sophie stood up from her chair, pale, trembling, 19 years old, and said, in a voice that cracked and then steadied, "No." Her mother turned on her, but Sophie had reached her breaking point, the true limit, beyond which a person will endure no more, and she stood in the long gallery, before the entire company, and told the truth. All of it, in a rush, like a dam bursting. It was not Kelmont who forgot herself, Sophie declared. It was I. It was we. Mother, I will not let her be dismissed for our lie. She turned to the Duke, her face as white as paper, her chin held high. Your Grace, the lady you danced with at your masquerade was not me. I was not there. I would not go. I am in love with another man, she confessed, her voice wavering. A poor man, and I would not be presented to you like a specimen at a fair. And my mother, to spare you any perceived slight, sent Kelmont in my place, masked, to stand in my stead. It was Kelmont you spoke with by the pillar. It was Kelmont you danced with, and it is Kelmont you have been searching for this past fortnight. Only you did not recognize her, because she is merely a maid, and no one thinks to look for anything in a maid. Tears streamed down her face now, but she did not falter. It was all a lie, and it was my mother's lie, and my lie, not hers. She only did as she was bid, as servants must, and I will not stand here and watch her ruined for doing what we made her do. There, now you know. Now you all know. Ruin us if you wish, but not her. And Sophie sat down, burying her face in her hands. The long gallery fell into an absolute silence. The Duke of Stormhaven slowly, deliberately, turned his head across the assembled company, and for the first time, looked with understanding at the tall, gray-templed maidservant standing against the wall. Emelyn met his gaze. There was no mask now, no furniture to hide behind, no place left to fold herself away. There was only the woman, seen at last, seen whole. The maid who was the masked lady, who was the voice in the library, who was the figure draped in doves. All of them. A single woman, standing against the wall in a plain gray gown. A duke looked at her, and the truth descended over his face like dawn breaking over a dark country. It was you, he said, his voice not loud, yet heard by the entire silent gallery. By the pillar. Oh, in the library. It was you. All of it was you. It was me, Your Grace, said Emelyn. And then she said the rest, for she was already ruined, and had nothing left to lose, because she had spent 30 years being furniture, and she would be furniture no longer, not for one more minute, not now that the mask was off for good. She spoke quietly to him, and to the entire staring company. her voice steady, a voice she was proud of. "You have been told this morning that I forgot my place. I did not forget it. I have never, for 1 hour of one day, forgotten my place. I was sent to your masquerade to remember it, to stand in a mask and be a lady's shadow, and to come away leaving nothing behind. And I did all of that. And one thing besides, which I was unable to help. When a man stood beside me and spoke to me as though I were a person, I answered him as a person, because behind a mask, for 1 hour, I was allowed to be one. That is my entire crime. I spoke to you truthfully, I could afford to. A mask to no one has nothing to lose, and a maid caught reading has even less. So, Your Grace, you have had from me the one thing your rank has kept from you your entire life. A person who told you the truth because she had nothing to gain by a lie. That is not a reason to dismiss a woman. But dismiss me you may, and you will. For the world is as it is made, and I am 34 and a servant, and you are a duke, and there is nothing more to be said." She dropped him a curtsy, a full one, grave and unhurried, a gesture of such dignity that it shamed every soul in that gallery. "I ask your pardon for the deceit. It was not mine to refuse. I will go and pack my box." And she turned to leave. "You will do nothing of the kind," said the Duke of Stormhaven. She stopped. He crossed the gallery to her. He walked its entire length, past the company, past Lady Bramwell, frozen as her ruin descended, past the weeping Sophie, past his sharp old aunt, sitting bolt upright with a light in her eye, like a woman watching a play unfold perfectly in its final act. He stopped directly in front of the tall, gray maidservant, close enough that she had to lift her steady eyes to his. And he stood there, a duke in his own grand house, before all his world, and he did not care who watched. "For a fortnight," he said, his voice low, but not so low that the gallery couldn't hear, for he intended them to hear. "I have believed I was losing my reason. I danced 1 hour with a woman I could not forget, and I could not find her again, and in her place, I found a stranger who wore her name, but not her soul. I thought myself mad or bewitched, or a fool, for I could not court the one, and could not stop wanting the other. And the other was a servant, and I told myself, a duke does not want a servant, and wanted her anyway. Every dawn, in that library, more than I have wanted anything since I was young enough to want." He drew a breath, and his cold face was no longer cold. "And now I am told it was one woman all along, that the lady I could not forget, and the maid I could not stop wanting, are one and the same. Do you know what that is to me? It is not a scandal. It is a reprieve. It is the mercy of God. For it means I am not mad, and I am not a fool. And the woman I have loved this fortnight, and the woman I loved that hour, are the same woman. And she is standing in front of me, and her name is not Bramwell. Her name is Kelmont, Your Grace," said Emelyn, her steady voice now faltering slightly. "Emelyn Kelmont, and she is a lady's maid, and you are a duke, and nothing you have said this morning alters either of those things by 1 grain." "No," said the Duke, "it does not, and I do not care." But Emelyn shook her head and stepped back from him, 1 step. It was the hardest step she had taken in her life. "You will care tomorrow," she said. "You will care when the county cuts you. You will care when your name becomes a jest from here to London. The great Duke of Stormhaven, who married his guest's washerwoman. The Duke who was gulled by a masquerade into wedding a servant of 34, with gray in her hair and roughness in her hands. You have been 6 years coming out of the dark, Your Grace. Do not come out of it into a thing the world will make you ashamed of. I will not be ashamed for you. I would rather go back into the road than be a stone tied around the neck of the one good thing to happen to you in 6 years. Let me go. It is the last true thing I can do for you. Let me go, and marry where the world will forgive you, and think of me kindly sometimes, at dawn, in the library. That is more than most servants get to be thought of kindly by the master. It is more than enough." And she curtsied again, and this time she did turn. She walked out of the long gallery with her back straight and her head high. She did not run, because running is how you are caught. And she left the Duke of Stormhaven standing in the middle of his own house, with his heart in his face, before the whole of his world. She would have gone. She meant to go. She got as far as the packing of her box, up under the eaves, before it was taken out of her hands. And it was Lady Eleonora who took it out of her hands, the sharp old aunt, 81 years old, and afraid of nothing on the earth or under it. She came up the servants' stairs herself, on her stick, panting, where no lady of 81 had any business. She sat herself down on Emmeline's narrow bed, and told her to stop packing and listen. "I danced at his christening," said Lady Eleonora, "and I danced at his wedding, and I have watched him these 6 years go about in a house full of ghosts, cold as a stone, doing his duty, taking no joy of anything. And I had given up hope of him. An old woman gives up hope at last, even of the ones she loves. I came to that ridiculous masquerade to bury the last of it, to watch him choose some suitable frightened child and settle into a second marriage as joyless as the first. And instead, I watched him dance twice with a woman in gray, and come alive under my eyes for 1 hour, like a man raised from the dead. And I have watched him this fortnight go to his library at dawn, to talk to a maidservant, and come away lighter than I have seen him in 6 years. And now you would take it from him. You would go back into the road out of nobility, out of not wishing to shame him. You would leave him to his ghosts and call it kindness." The old woman's black eyes were fierce. "It is not kindness. It is cowardice, dressed as kindness, which is the commonest coat cowardice wears. You are afraid, not of shaming him, of wanting. You have wanted nothing so long that the wanting frightens you worse than the road. I know. I am old. I have seen it before. Now you listen to me, girl, for I have not climbed these stairs at 81 to be disobeyed." And she told Emelyn what she meant to do. It was Lady Eleonora who made the marriage possible in the end, and she did it not by softening the world, but by facing it down, which was the only way she had ever done anything. She did not pretend the county would not talk. She said the county would talk itself hoarse, and then it would tire, as counties do, and the thing would be old news by Christmas and forgotten by Lady Day. The only question worth asking, she said, was whether a man was to throw away the one happiness of his life to spare himself a season's gossip, and what kind of a coward would counsel him to it. She said that she, Lady Eleonora, would stand up with the maid at the wedding and receive her afterward. She would bring the whole weight of her 81 years, and her ancient name, to bear on any door that dared to close, and she should like to see the county matron bold enough to cut a woman Lady Eleonora had chosen to notice. And she did more than that, the shrewd old woman. She saw to it that the thing was done rightly, that Emelyn was not lifted up out of the road by a duke's whim, to be forever the servant he had raised, forever beholden to him for it, forever in the world's eye, and perhaps her own, the beggar at the feast. No, Lady Eleonora settled on Emelyn, out of her own private fortune, a sum that made her a woman of small independent means, so that when she came to the Duke, she came not empty-handed and grateful, but standing on her own ground, however little of it, a woman who could, if she chose, refuse him and live. It was not much, and it did not need to be much. It only needed to be enough that the choice was free. For Lady Eleonora had understood, as the Duke himself had begun to understand, the one thing about Emelyn Kelmont that mattered above all the rest. She would not be rescued. She would come to him as a person, or she would not come at all. And so the old woman gave her the means to come as a person, and then left the two of them to it, and went downstairs to begin, with enormous relish, the terrifying of the county. The Duke came to Emelyn that evening in the garden by the old dove-cote, where the half-wild doves that trusted no one settled on her shoulders in the last of the light. He came alone, and he did not command, and he did not plead. He stood a little apart, and let the doves be, and he said what he had come to say, plainly, in the flat, true voice she had come to love in the library at dawn. "My aunt tells me," he said, "that you would have gone into the road sooner than shame me, and that she has settled money on you, so that you need not marry me for bread. So there is nothing now to make you take me, not need, not gratitude, for you owe me nothing. It is I who owe you, and not the world's approval, for the world does not approve and will not for a 12-month at the least. There is nothing left to make you say yes, which is exactly my aunt informs me the only condition on which you would ever be got to say it. She is a terrifying old woman, and she is nearly always right. So I have come to ask you with nothing in my hand. No need, no gratitude, no world, only a man of 46 who was dead for 6 years, and whom you woke by a pillar in a library, by a dovecote. You woke him without ever once trying, without ever once wanting a single thing from him. Marry me, Emelyn, not because you must, only because you would, if you would. And Emelyn Kelmont stood by the dovecote in the last light, with the trusting doves upon her. And she made, for the first time in 30 years, a choice that no mistress, and no need, and no fear had made for her. A choice that was wholly her own, standing on her own small ground, wanting nothing she did not already have, choosing only because she chose. You never once tried to take anything from me, she said. Every soul who ever had power over me used it my whole life from the day I was 12. And you had all the power in the world over a masked nobody, and a maid caught reading, and you spent none of it, not one grain. You let me be a person. You are the only man living who ever did. She lifted her hands, and the doves rose from them in a soft white clatter into the evening, and she was free-handed, and she reached out and took his hand instead. The first thing in 30 years she had reached out and taken for herself. Yes, she said. Not because I must, because I would. I have wanted to since the pillar. I only dared not until now. They were married in the little church on the Farfall land, quietly, with Lady Eleonora standing up beside the bride like a small, fierce, ancient guardian, daring the county with her eye. And the county, which had talked itself hoarse as the old woman foretold, came in the end. Because a duchess is a duchess, however she is made, and because Lady Eleonora had let it be understood, with great sweetness, that she would remember to her dying day precisely who had come, and precisely who had stayed away. There were empty pews, and there were cold faces, and there was a deal of talk that reached the bride's ears, and she bore it with the steady stillness she had worn her whole life, for she had been talked over as furniture for 30 years, and to be talked over as a duchess was, she found, a good deal easier to bear. Sophie was there at the front, glowing, for Sophie's own story had come right in the wreck of the scheme, come right in the only way it could have, with the Duke lost to her, and lost so publicly. Lady Bramwell had no more use for her daughter as a coin to spend, and had been forced, weeping and railing, to let the girl have her curate at last. There was no grander match left to hold out for, and the family's credit was past mending in any case. So Sophie had her Mr. Adair, and his £40 a year, and was happier on £40 a year with the man she loved than her mother had ever been on £10,000 with the man she had not. And she never forgot, to the end of her life, that a lady's maid had bought her one more month of hope with a mask. A lady's maid who had taken the whole ruin on her own shoulders, in a long gallery, rather than see the girl forced. She named her first daughter Emelyn. It seemed the least that she could do. Lady Bramwell did not come to the wedding. She went abroad in the end, where a thin income stretched further, and a soured reputation was not known, and she lived out her years in a foreign town, neither happy nor unhappy, only diminished. A woman who had gambled her daughter, her servant, and her own good name on a scheme, and lost the whole stake. She had the rest of her life to reflect that she had held at the start of it a good enough hand, if only she had been content to play it fair. She was not a monster. That was the pity of her. She was only a frightened woman who had done a cruel thing out of a small terror of the road, the very road she had been willing to send her servant down. And there is no triumph clean enough to take all the sadness out of watching such a one lose the thing she wrecked herself to keep. And Emelyn Kelmont, who had gone into service at 12 and been furniture for 31 years, who had trained her whole self into a thing that eyes slid off, became the Duchess of Stormhaven, and she learned slowly, over the good years that followed, how to be looked at. It did not come easily. A woman does not unlearn 30 years of invisibility in a season. There were mornings she woke in the great bed, in the great room, and did not know herself, and reached from old habit for the plain gray gown that was not there. There were dinners where she sat at the foot of the long table, which the Duke had lengthened again to its full grand length for the pleasure of seeing her the whole way down it, and she had to remind herself that she was not to rise and clear it. There were the doves, which she still fed with her own hands every dawn. Some habits of the serving years she kept on purpose to remember by, and the doves did not know she was a duchess and loved her exactly the same, which she found a great comfort. And there was the great house itself, which had stood dark 6 years, and now blazed. Not with masquerades, for they gave no more masquerades, but with the plain, warm light of a house that has woken up, a house with a mistress in it, who reads in the library at dawn without hiding the book, and a master who comes to read beside her, and is not cold any longer. He laughed, sometimes, the rusty, surprised sound coming easier year by year, until it was not rusty at all. The mask she kept, the gray domino of silk and silver, the mask she had worn 1 hour by a pillar, she kept folded in a box, and then, at the Duke's asking, framed. It hung in the library at Farfall, where the two of them sat at dawn. A strange thing to hang among the books, a mask, and no one who did not know the story could ever say why a great house should keep framed and honored one old scrap of gray silk, but they knew why. She had put it on once to be no one, and she had found behind it, for 1 hour, the person she had folded away at 19 and thought lost for good. And a man had seen that person behind the mask, and then without it, in the ballroom, the library, the garden. He had seen her when the whole world had spent 30 years not seeing her, and he had never once, from the first hour to the last, been able to look at anyone else. She had gone to that masquerade to be a shadow, to stand in another woman's place, and come away leaving nothing behind, seen by no one, wanted by no one, a nobody in borrowed silk. And she had come out of it, by the long, strange road of that autumn, the Duchess of Stormhaven, seen at last, wanted at last, and looked at every day of her life, by the one man who had looked past the gray gown, and the gray hair, and the roughened hands. The man who found the soul the world had discarded, who cradled her and brought her home. Thank you for journeying with this story to its very end. Please share which city you're tuning in from, and what emotions this tale stirred within you. And don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss a single new story.